Mimu, things ain't that white. You are what? Oh, he's stupid. All right, all right. Welcome everyone to yet another video. I have a great video for you all today, and I want to thank you all for tuning in. I want to say a special thank you all to all my subscribers, those that have subscribed to the channel. Please be sure that when you subscribe, that you hit the notification bell. I have received a few emails from subscribers saying that they are not being notified each time I release a new video. So please be sure to hit that notification bell when you do subscribe. So thank you very much for subscribing. Also, I've begun scheduling out live videos just like this particular one. But the reason why I'm doing that, this particular video is pre-recorded, so it's not live, even though it was scheduled a week in advance as a live video. In order to help resolve some of the notification issues that I have heard that is occurring with some of my subscribers not getting notified, I've begun scheduling out videos that I will be releasing in advance as a live video. So that way you're alerted in your feed that my video, this particular video, will be dropping very soon, so you can take a look at it or at least keep an eye out of that on that video. So that's why you perhaps saw this video as a scheduled live, and so I'm doing that to help my subscribers at least be informed of my new videos dropping. Seeing that I'm hearing that some subscribers aren't getting notified, so I'm not sure what's going on with the YouTube algorithm. But until we know what's going on, just keep an eye out for any live updates videos. But this particular video is pre-recorded. At some point, I'm going to be doing live videos. My channel is growing, so I'm still very small. And so when I have enough people, and I think that I have enough people willing to engage in a live video, I'll begin having those live videos out. But until then, the videos are going to be pre-recorded, scheduled out in advance for you all to kind of watch them. So thank you all that have watched past videos. Thank you for your support. Thank you for to those that haven't subscribed yet, but at least have given great comments. I read a lot of your comments. I get some of your emails. I read those too, and they're very encouraging. So thank you, thank you, thank you. All right, so let's get to it. Today's video today is perhaps going to be one of the most insightful video I've ever done. I'm going to be uncovering a huge part of our hidden history, hidden American history that isn't mainstream as it relates to slavery in the United States. So this is in continuation to the events around reparation. And so it's also in continuation with the recent decision made by the California task force on a vote that was passed last Tuesday, 5-4, favoring a lineage-based compensation to so-called American descendants of slaves. According to the task force, just a refresher for some of you that may have heard it, and some of you that haven't heard it, according to the task force, they voted to base compensation, which we don't know what that would be yet, to American descendants of slaves based on a particular period. So the compensation, whatever that compensation is, will only be given to those that were free or enslaved in the country during time periods all the way to the end of the 19th century, or those that migrated also to the United States by the end of the 19th century. So this particular video that I'm doing today will address that. I've done videos in the past regarding that, but this particular one will be focused on lineage and as well as the eligibility factor, which is how they base their decision. So I'm going to talk about the time period which they based this decision on, which is the period of slavery in this country. I'm going to give you a different side of the story on slavery, which isn't mainstream, but is also part of the American history. It's one that is not being told. We don't have this story in the movies. We don't have this in our history book, at least not undergrad. But it's part of the American history. The story that says that there were black people in the United States, African American people sold other African American people as slaves, bought them and sold them as slaves. That part of the story, of the history, hasn't been told and for some reason was omitted in our history book. So I'm going to cover that because this is the basis in which the reparations argument is being had. On this basis that white folks enslaved black people and black people were the victims, white folks somehow did wrong by black folks and white folks need to pay up in terms of monetary value based on some so-called debt that black folks are claiming that white people owe them. So did slavery happen in this country? That we all know that's true. Slavery occurred in this country. You know, a portion of white population enslaved a portion of black people in this country. So we know that story. That story isn't new. We know that slaves were brought in here from primarily Africa. So that story is not new. We all know the story. What we don't know and what has been hidden from mainstream conversation or coverage regarding slavery is that there were free black men and women in the United States that equally bought and sold slaves and profited from the business of slavery. So I'm going to deal with that today. I do want to start by saying that this video is going to disturb some of you, if not most of you. This video is going to be heavy for a lot of people to digest because the information I'm going to be giving out are factual based information. This is part of our American history. None of the information or what I'm going to talk about today is fabricated. As a matter of fact, there's been coverage on this, not as mainstream, not widely mainstream coverage, but there have been books, editorials. There have been articles written about this by not just white historians, but also African American historians. African American historians like Carter G. Woodson, who died in 1950. African American historians like John Hope Franklin have written about this extensively. We have authors like Larry Cougar, who wrote the book Black Slave Owners, and also authors like Michael P. Johnson, who wrote the book on Black Masters. Okay, so there have been authors and prominent authors and historians that have covered this. So don't just take my word for it. This has been covered. But then why is it this mainstream? Why haven't we had movies made on this? Why isn't this in our history book? That would be the logical question. I don't know why. I don't know why the Department of Education intentionally, if it was intentional, omitted this part of the history from our history books, at least the ones that are taught in undergrad, in colleges. Because I certainly didn't learn this part of it in college. Perhaps those that study history in an advanced level, maybe those that go on to have a doctorate in history, perhaps they learn this part of the history. But it isn't taught in the undergrad level in colleges. I certainly didn't learn this in my undergrad level in colleges. However, the information is true. It's part of our American history. The reason why I'm covering this, more importantly, is that the story of slavery has been primarily used as a weapon against two groups in our country. Against white people. If it's been used to demonize white people because slavery, the act of slavery, while being evil, was primarily seen as an evil act committed by primarily white people against black people, black Africans. So that's one group that has been demonized by the story, by the one-sided story that we have on slavery. The other group that has been demonized also are Africans, black Africans, on the standpoint that Africans sold African Americans, or the ancestors of those who would become African Americans, sold them into slavery. We know this because we've seen movies like Roots, which is a fiction. We've seen movies like 12 Years a Slave, okay, which is based on an actual event. We've also seen other subsequent movies on slavery. However, what movie that is, or whichever movie you can think of, most of, if not all of these movies, depict the one-sided story that we all know about, which is white people stole black Africans from Africa and enslaved them in this country. That is the story that we all know. But I am here to tell you there's another story, there's another part of that story, which is part of also the American story, which is that African Americans, those who became African Americans later on, their ancestors, black people in this country, bought and enslaved other black people in this country, in Louisiana, in Georgia, in South Carolina, in Virginia, in Texas, states that are considered as Confederate states, states that mostly practice slavery. That's a fact. I'm going to show you records. I'm going to show you documentation. I'm also going to show you evidence that actually show this, that talk about this. So then why was this hidden from us, from most mainstream? Why isn't this put in movies? Why isn't this story, told in a lot of the Hollywood movies that we've seen told about slavery? I don't know why. Could it be that a lot of execs, a lot of studio heads, a lot of directors and producers intentionally decide not to talk about this story because it could incite a different type of emotion from black people against white people and may in turn backfire and cause black people to call them racist like they've already been called that? Could it also be that the reason why this was omitted from our history book could be because it could create an unnecessary tension from black people who may just see it as an act of white people trying to rewrite or whitewash history? Could that be it? I don't know. Whatever the decision, whatever the reason behind the decision that was made to not have movies made by this, to not have it in our history book or taught in our schools, that black people, however how small, contributed and benefited from slavery. They owned lands, they owned slaves, and in many times dealt with their slaves as viciously and dehumanizing ways as a lot of the white planters did. That is disturbing. So this video is going to be an eye-opener. I guarantee you by the end of this video, you are going to see and have a different perception about black people. This video is not intended for you to have an animosity against the black race. This video is intended for you to somehow begin to see black people in a very hateful way. No. What this video is intended to do is to hopefully point out the deficiencies or the weakness in our history. The fact that many of us, most of us, don't have a pure history, whatever race you come from. Our history isn't flattering. None of us have a pure history. Our lineage, our ancestors, depending on whatever race you come from, have all done things that when we look back and we stare down the barrel of history, we find that there are very unflattering things that we would wish that our ancestors and the race that we come from did not do. And so this video is an attempt for you to see that your race isn't perfect. And so while you're casting stones at one particular race for what you believe they had done to wrong your race, understand that your race also took part in it. Your race, I'm talking about the black race, we played a role in this. I do want to say that the institution of slavery and the practice of slavery is the oldest, or perhaps one of the oldest institutions in human civilization. These practices has been going on all through the Dark Ages and even through our modern world and our modern era. It is happening back as far back as the Kemites, the Egyptians, when they ruled. Africans sold Africans during that period in time and all the way through the modern era. It happened with the Romans. The Romans sold Romans. Yes, Europeans sold Europeans during the time of the Roman Empire. It also happened in the Western Hemisphere. The Native Americans sold Native Americans in the Western Hemisphere. Scandinavian countries, Sweden and Denmark, the Vikings, okay, those ones sold each other. So the practice of slavery is not a new practice. It's evil. It's humane. It's inhumane. Howbeit, nonetheless, it's a practice that occurred throughout the ages. So it's not new. It's not right, but it isn't new. And I know a lot of us, when we learned about the history of slavery, we saw it as white folks in the Americas, in the Western world, going to Africa to snatch people up. That's the story we all know about slavery. And so the idea that white folks did this because they hate black people is false. A few white people here committed this act. The majority of white people in the Western world, in the United States, did not take part in the Slavery Act or the buying and selling of people. Historians will tell you that of the population that existed in the United States at the time, 1.6% of white population took part in slavery. So it wasn't the majority of white people, which is why slavery was mostly committed in the South. It wasn't also the majority of black Africans that sold people into slavery. It was committed by black Arabs in Africa that sold African people who were helpless, who were snatched from their villages and sold to white people. You heard me right, sold. Okay? So white people didn't go to Africa and snatch people up or steal people from their homeland. Most of the slaves that came to this country were bought. They were sold by a few black Arabs that sold their people to different part of the world. Just like the Romans sold their people to different part of the world. Just like the Native Americans sold their people to different part of the world. This was business as usual back in the ages. So I wanted to get that part out so you understand that. Okay? So you understand that. So while you're getting upset and mad over a one-sided history that you were taught, understand that those of you who point fingers at these two groups, black Africans and also white people, you're about to find out that your ancestors also contributed in the buying and selling of your ancestors in the United States. And it's important for you to know that. It's important for you to understand this, that no race is perfect. I know many of us, if we all could go back to change history, to rewrite history, and to correct some of the things that our ancestors and our race did, I have no doubt that many of us would do that without thinking of it. But nonetheless, we can't go back and change history. History has been written. But what we can do is write our own history from this point forward. You can choose to be different. You can choose to write your history the way you want it to be written. You can choose to be on the side of good and not the side of evil. You can choose to write your own history. Your own history. History is still being written every day. We're all writing our histories. And so I'm hoping that this video, while it opens a lot of your eyes to the information I'm about to show you, that you don't get angry and become bitter, but you're more contrite, and you begin to look at your citizen, your fellow citizen, white, black, wherever part of the world they come from, you start to see them as equal and have respect for them, because most of the people you're looking at didn't condone, and still don't condone slavery. They reject it and condemn it as much as you did. So understand that that's what I want to talk to you about. So I needed to set that ground. I needed to set that tempo so you understand where this is coming from. Okay? This is also coming from a point of view that if we're going to be talking about reparations, which the conversation of reparation has been centered around the idea of one group owed something from the other group. Understand that you're about to get a different point of view now that's probably going to shape how you think about reparations moving forward. It's probably going to make you think differently about it. So let's get started, because this is the day that the Lord has made, and I will rejoice and I will be glad in it. The Lord has anointed me today, brothers and sisters, to tell the truth. We're going to tell the truth today and shame the devil. Can I get an amen? Amen. We're going to tell the truth. Okay? So let's get into this video, because I want to show you a lot of things. We're going to be using an editorial written by Henry Louis Gates. Henry Louis Gates is a renowned filmmaker, a respected professor at Harvard University, who's written and made documentaries and written books. And we're going to use an editorial that he wrote on his online magazine, which is called The Roots, an online magazine for African Americans. I decided to specifically use his version of the story because most of us know and are familiar with his work. Most of us know who Dr. Henry Louis Gates is. So we're familiar with him. And so I wanted to talk to you guys, and I want to show you some of the findings. The information I'm going to show you isn't going to be pretty. It's going to really hit home. It's going to make you see things differently. And I'm hoping it's going to cause you to have a different perspective about your stance on racism and no longer see your white counterpart as totally evil or racist, which is mostly what black people see white people as. White people are inherently racist. That is not true. A few white people committed a heinous act. Few, not the majority. So also hopefully will help you see that your African brothers and sisters didn't all participate in the selling of you to this country. A few Arab Africans did this. It's also going to show you that not all black people in this country that were brought in this country were all slaves. There were a great number of them that participated in slavery and slavery act and traded their own for profit. And so let's get into this. Okay, so here's the online magazine that was founded by Henry Louis Gates, called The Roots. This is where we're going to get most of the information. I'm going to talk to you about a few of the slave owners that own property. I'll talk to you about the number of people and the number of free black men and women that own properties and own slaves in this country. And we're going to try to identify some of who those people were in terms of their names in history. So he starts off. Did black people own slaves? So that's the question. So he goes on by saying one of the most vexing questions in African American history is whether free African Americans themselves owned slaves. The short answer to this question, as you might suspect, is yes, of course. Now, I have a problem with that tone. Yes, of course. I don't think so. Most people don't know this, right? So I think that particular sentence was tone deaf, because most African Americans and most black people in this country or around the world don't know this. They don't. So I wouldn't use yes, of course. We all knew this. No, I wouldn't use that, because if we did, we would not be basing reparations and the compensation packages around reparations on a one-sided viewpoint that black people were slaves in this country and white people need to pay up because it was slave owners. Because how do you pay reparations if you knew that there were black slave owners in this country? How do you decipher who amongst the descendants of slaves are also descendants of slave owners? I call those American descendants of black slave owners, ADOBSO. Those are the ones I call the American descendants of black slave owners in this country. So how do you decipher who they are? Because the history tells us that we've got descendants of people that own slaves that are black African Americans in this country, as equally as we have descendants of those who were who were enslaved in this country. So I wouldn't use, of course, we all know this. No, because most people don't know this. Many of you watching this right now didn't know this. All right, so he says, the short answer to the question, as you might already suspect, is yes, of course. Some free black people in this country bought and sold other black people and did so at least since 1654, continuing to do so right through the Civil War. Now, for me, he says, the really fascinating question about black slave owning are how many black masters were involved and how many slaves did they own and why did they own slaves? So that was a question that he was asking for himself. And I would also add, I want to know too. Now, the answer to these questions are complex, and historians have been arguing for some time over whether free black purchased family members as slaves in order to protect them. Okay, so let me talk about that. When I heard about this years ago, this is when I was going through my undergrad degree. Again, this was not taught in school. This was not taught in history. I didn't take a history lesson about this. But I came across information that suggested that black people owned black people in this country. However, the way it was told to me and the way that information was presented to me was that these small pocket of black people owned, as a benevolence gesture, they owned or bought their family members to keep them from being sold into slavery, to keep them from being owned by other white planters. That's how it was sold to me. It was a benevolence type of attitude, a good deed by a few free black men and women to buy other slaves or their family members to shield them, okay, from being sold or bought by other white slave owners. That's how it was sold to me. Now, while that is true, that is not all the way true. Okay, that is a small pocket, a small percentage of people, black people, that did that. You're also going to find out that even of the ones that bought their family members, okay, to protect them, they in turn sold some of their family members who they fell out of favor with. Yes, these same black people that supposedly bought their family members as a way to shield them, there were stories and accounts that some of these ones sold their family members to white planters that they knew were vicious and had a brutal tactics of dealing with slaves just because they fell out of love for them. Okay, so I want you to just understand that these things happen. Okay, so let's keep going. The answer to these questions are complex, and historians have been arguing for some time over whether free blacks purchased family members as slaves in order to protect them, motivated on the other hand by benevolence and philanthropy, as historian Carter G. Woodson puts it, or whether on the other hand They purchased other black people as an act of exploitation, primarily to exploit their free labor for profit, just as white slave owners did. The evidence showed that unfortunately both things are true. The great African American history, John Hope Franklin, states this clearly. The majority of Negro owners of slaves had some personal interest in their property, but he admits there were instances, however, in which free Negroes had a real economic interest in the institution of slavery and held slaves in order to improve their economic status. Okay? So it goes on and on here. So let's start here. And for a time, free black people could even own the service of white indentured servants in Virginia as well. Okay, think about that for a second. Think about the idea in old America. We're talking about 18th century, 19th century. We're talking about 1700s, the 1800s. During the period which slavery was very prominent in this country. Think about the image that we all have of slavery. Just have that picture in your mind. So I want you to have a picture of slavery in your mind right now. Think about that entire era where black people were whipped, black people were brought into this country. They were slaves. They worked on cotton plantation. They worked on sugarcane plantation. They were owned by white people. Think about that picture. Now, I want you to now think of that same picture, but in reverse. Think about these same black people being whipped and owned. But this time, think about these slave owners as black people doing that to black people. And on top of that, think about black people who are black masters and slave owners having white people work for them. That's incomprehensible, right? That's unimaginable. You can't imagine that, especially with the image that we all have. But this is historically documented. These are the things that happened. There were white indentured servants. I mentioned these back in my other videos. There were white indentured servants that worked on cotton plantation for both white slave owners as well as black slave owners. These are not to be confused with slaves. Okay? These were indentured servants. Indentured servants are people who were under contract. Okay? Most times there were a lot of white indentured servants that came from England, from Britain, to the United States. And many times they worked off whatever labor cost, transportation cost they incurred for coming into this country. So they worked that out with their masters or with the owner of the property and say, hey, I will work for you for 3 years, 5 years, whatever that is. Okay? During this period, once that time gets up, you release me and I'm free. So these are not to be confused with slaves. Slaves didn't get paid. Indentured servants did. Another thing with indentured servants was that they also had a timeline which they served and they were going to be free. Slaves didn't have that luxury. Many times black people that were slaves were born into slavery. In many cases, they died as slaves. So they didn't have that luxury. So indentured servants are not to be confused with slaves. Nonetheless, we had whites that were indentured servants, as well as we had black people that were indentured servants. So these white indentured servants worked for black slave owners. Imagine that for a second. In places that we consider today as the most racist states that slavery ever took place in. Just think about that for a second. Okay? Virginia, South Carolina, Mississippi. Let me tell you about Mississippi. I've got a story for you about Mississippi. Again, along the lines of some of the perception that we have about these places, that they're so racist, right? I remember long time ago, I lived in New York. And I remember coming to Texas, I was going to visit my family members in Texas. So I took the train from New York. I rode the train, the Amtrak. And one of the stops along the line was Mississippi. I remember this particular time, the Amtrak will stop there for about 15 minutes. They usually would have these random stops. Based on my perception, and based on a lot of our perception of these states that we say they are racist, I refuse to get out of the train. When everybody else got off the train to stretch their legs and all of that, I refused to get off the train. I stayed on the train for fear that I was going to be attacked by white racist people. That never happened, by the way, okay? But that was a fear that I had in Mississippi. True story, right? Because of what we've heard, and many of us still hear that today. Now imagine Mississippi being a place, one of the places that they allowed, I don't know if they allowed them, but I would say they allowed them, that black people own slaves in the so-called racist states, Confederate states. Now that is crazy to me. That is crazy to me. Okay? Virginia, Georgia, okay? Louisiana. These are places that most of us, when we think of slavery and we think of Confederate practices and Confederate flags, and we think of Nazis and we think of white supremacists and all of that, these are the places we think about because of what has been told to us, because of how. Now, are there white supremacists and all of those people that live there? Of course. But imagine that even in those racist states that you had black people in the United States owning and enslaving other black people. And in many times they even had white servants work for them. So I wanted you to have that picture in your mind, because a lot of you don't have this. It has been told to us. But let's keep going. Okay. All right. So let's read that again so we can kind of catch up. Now, for a time, free black people could even own the service of white indentured servants in Virginia as well. Free black owned slaves in Boston by 1724 and in Connecticut by 1783. By 1790, 48 black people in Maryland owned 143 slaves. One particularly notorious black Maryland farmer named Nat Butler. I'm going to talk to you guys about Nat Butler. Nat Butler, in my opinion, he's the scum of the earth. I am going to talk to you about this particular black slave owner. We're going to leave him for the end, and I'm going to talk to you about that. He, in my opinion, of all the slave owners, he is perhaps the scummiest person, if there's a word, a real piece of work. Nat Butler is. So Nat Butler regularly purchased and sold Negroes for the Southern trade, Halliburton wrote. Perhaps the most insidious and desperate attempt to defeat the rights of black people to own slaves was the statement made on the eve of the Civil War by a group of free black people of color in New Orleans, offering their services to the Confederacy, in part because they were fearful of their own enslavement. Okay, so you're about to find out. Another part that was very troubling to me, and I'm about to read that, is that you're about to find out that black people, right before the Civil War broke out, there were a huge number of black slave owners who opposed the abolishment of slavery. That's crazy. They opposed the abolishment of slavery, that they aligned themselves with the Confederate soldiers in the South, in Louisiana, in Virginia. And they swore their loyalty to them to defend and fight for the South against the North. That is disturbing to me, because many times what we've often heard and what we've often equated the South with is Confederacy. Many times when we even see the flag, we have there's this thing that we all have inside of us, that it awakens a kind of an emotional, not so pleasant feeling inside of many of us, because we all have heard and we know what that whole thing stood for. It's the same way we feel about when we see the Nazi flag. There's a feeling that we have when we see that, because there's an image, there's a memory, there's a story behind all of that. Now to now find out there were black people in this country that aligned themselves with the South, those to fight the North and oppose abolishing slavery as much as the white slave owners did at the time, because they had a lot to gain and a lot to lose by the abolishment of slavery. That part of the story is perhaps one of the most disturbing aspects of this whole thing. Right? That black people did this, aligned themselves with this, and you're about to find out that why. Because they gained from the selling of black people as equally as the white slave owners. Again, let me remind everyone, okay? It was a small pocket of white people that did this, just like it was a small pocket of black people that did this. The majority of black people in this country were owned by white people. So let's make that clear. That is the part that we all know. What this video is going to tell you and is attempting to do is that not all black people that lived in the United States were slaves. Just like not all white people that lived in the United States were slave owners. Majority of them opposed it. This is why we have abolitionists. This is why we had white people back then attempt and helped a lot of black people through the Underground Railroad to escape to North. Okay? So let's keep going. All right. So it says again, perhaps the most insidious or desperate attempt to defend the rights of black people to own slaves was a statement made on the eve of the Civil War by a group of free blacks of color in New Orleans, offering their services to the Confederacy, in part because they were fearful of their own enslavement. The free colored population native of Louisiana owned slaves, and they are dearly attached to the native. This is what they're saying. They are dearly attached to their native land, and they are ready to shed their blood for her defense. They have no sympathy for abolitionism, no love for the North, but have plenty for Louisiana. They will fight for her in 1861 as they fought to defend New Orleans from the British in 1814 through to 1815. This is what the black free men and women were saying back then. Now these guys were, to put it bluntly, opportunists par excellence, as Noah Andrew Trudeau and James G. Hollingsworth Jr. explained. Once the war broke out, some of these same black men formed 14 companies of a militia composed of 440 men and were organized by the governor in May of 1861 into the Native Guard Louisiana, swearing to fight to defend the Confederacy. Imagine that for a second. Although given no combat role, the Guards, reaching a peak of 1,000 volunteers, became the first Civil War unit to appoint black officers. Now, when New Orleans fell in the late April of 1862 to the Union, about 10% of these men, not missing a beat, now formed the Native Guard / Corps d'Afrique to defend the Union. Joel A. Roger noted this phenomenon in his 100 Amazing Facts. The Negro slaveholder, like the white ones, fought to keep their chattel in the Civil War. Roger also noted that some of these black men, including those in New Orleans, at the outbreak of the war, fought to perpetuate slavery. Okay, so at this point right now, some of you are probably already starting to get that feeling that I got when I came across this information. Okay, so now I'm going to talk to you about who the slave owners were in terms of the black slave owners. I'm going to focus on a particular sets of them. Okay, I'm going to talk to you about who they are. But before we go into who they were, I want to talk to you about the number of black people, because it's important for you to know how many there were. Okay, it's important for you to know, because up until this point, some of you may be thinking, okay, there were probably a few hundreds. Okay, that's what I thought based on what was given to me years ago. But no, there weren't just a few hundreds. There were thousands of them that owned slaves. So you're about to find out how many there are. Okay. Now, how many slaves did black people own? Okay. So what do the actual number of black slave owners and their slaves tell us? In 1830, the year most carefully studied by Carter G. Woodson, about 13.7%, roughly 319,599 to be exact, of the black population was free. Of these, 3,776 free Negroes owned almost 13,000 slaves, 12,907 to be exact, out of a total of 2 million slaves. So again, not to be confused, let's not confuse it. Most of the slaves that were in this country were owned by white people. Okay, that is not news. We all know this. They were owned by a few percentage of white people that owned slaves and practiced slavery. So that's the part that we all know. That's not new. What is new is that we have 3,776 free Negroes that owned almost 13,000 slaves in this country. That's a huge number. Okay? Now, slaves, out of 2 million slaves owned in the United States. So the number of slaves owned by black people overall was quite small in comparison with the number owned by white people. So he goes on to say, okay, in his essay, The Known World of Free Black Slave Holders, Thomas J. Presley, using Woodson's statistics, calculated that 54, or about 1% of these black slave owners in 1830 owned between 20 to 84 slaves. 172, about 4%, owned between 10 to 19 slaves. A majority of them, 3,550, about 94%, each owned between 1 and 9 slaves. Crucially, 42% owned just 1 slave. So you see that, okay? So that is a disturbing statistic. That is a disturbing fact. The numbers are great, large enough, at least large enough and significant enough for this to have made it into the United States history book. Again, I don't know why this was omitted from the history book. I can't tell you why. I'm not on the board, okay? I don't know why. I can only guess, perhaps, is to spare black people that feeling. Because when you compare 2 million to 13,000, it's far in between by comparison, okay? However, in my viewpoint, based on the perception that we all have about our white counterparts, our white citizens in this country, based on the negative feelings we all have about them in this country, on the basis that they enslaved black people, I think it's equally fair for this story to have been told in movies and the history book. It's important that black people understand their history in the entirety. Because you have black people today, okay, walking around with this notion and with this belief that they were the victim of slavery. Again, even while most black people were enslaved in this country, at least most of the slaves that came in were slaves in this country. Most of them were. Nonetheless, there were over 300,000 that became free, many of whom were born free, died free, and others were enslaved and became freed later on. These ones walked hard, made a lot of money, purchased lands, and became slave owners. That story equally needs to be told. That story equally needs to be told because that is part of the American history. Okay, so now we're going to talk about who the slave owners are. I'm going to show you, and I'm going to identify a few of the slave owners. I picked these ones because of the stories around who they are, or who they were, I should say. And at the end of it, I'm going to talk to you about Nat Butler. Okay? And I'm going to tell you about who he was and the events around them. And I'm also going to address a lot of the misconceptions that a lot of us have, especially those that are championing reparations today. Okay? They're saying, and the reason for the whole reparations conversation is that part of the conversation is that black people were owed a promise, a debt. And the argument has always been that if we had not been denied 40 acres and a mule, we would be whole today. Black folks would have been able to pass generational wealth down from one generation to another. That is what most people tell you, especially black people tell you. I had a video, my last video on this, where I talked about, it was titled Why Reparations Will Never Be Paid to ADOS. You should go watch that video. I covered in that, and I addressed this one point and said, I don't agree that if black folks had somehow had 40 acres and a mule, I don't agree that that would somehow have helped to shrink the wealth gap. I don't agree with that. And I talked about it in that video. I'm about to show you why I made that statement. I'm about to show you why that is. Okay? The reason why I don't agree and didn't agree with that is because these 3,700 slave owners, which we're about to go into each one of them today, all had lands. They all had acres of land, as upwards as 900 acres of land. They all had lands that they either bought because they became successful in their trade, or they inherited, okay, from their family line, either from white slave owners that married them, or that was their father, because a lot of times we all know that a lot of slaves were raped. And so when they became free, they inherited some of these properties from white slave owners, and they inherited this and in turn owned this property. It's a historical fact. So the question is, where are these lands? Where are they? Because they were owned by black slave owners. Black slave owners in Louisiana, black slave owners in Texas, black slave owners in Virginia, in South Carolina. These lands, are they still somehow in their family? Do they still have these lands? I don't know. But somehow that argument about if black people own 40 acres and a mule will somehow shrink the wealth gap. Okay? That's baseless. Because black folks economically have done much better over the years. Okay? There'd be more black millionaires that have been recorded in history. Now, the entire black collective, as a collective, hasn't really moved a lot. But a lot of black people have really thrived and been successful without 40 acres and a mule. Not to mention that we do have some imposters, some black people who had lands from this era passed down to them, and they live in the southern states. You didn't know that, did you? Okay? You didn't know that. So that's why I don't buy the argument that somehow if we had the 40 acres and a mule, we would be whole. No. Okay? So I don't know what these families that are black, where those lands are. I don't know if they lost it. I don't know if they sold it off. I don't know. But black folks did have a percentage of black people, especially the ones who are descendants of these slave owners, had lands that were passed to them. Now, how far into the generation did this land get passed on? I don't know. But we had black people that own lands. Period. Okay. So, here is the part that I want to cover. So let me go ahead and cover the idea behind some of these slaves were purchased as a way to shield their family members. Okay, so let's talk about that part. It is reasonable to assume that 42% of free black slave owners who owned just one slave probably owned a family member to protect that person, as did many other black slave owners who owned only slightly larger number of slaves. As Woodson puts it in his 1924's Free Negro Owners of Slaves in the United States in 1830, the census records showed that the majority of Negro owners of slaves were such from the point of view of philanthropy. Okay, so let me talk about the census record real quickly. I do also want to make a correction in one of my videos, the same video I talked about, which I stated that in that video, the title, why reparations will never be paid. I made a statement which I want to correct today. The statement I made in that video was that the first time we saw black people ever counted in the United States, right, was in 1870. Okay, I want to correct that. Okay, that is not totally true. What I should have said is the first time we saw African Americans counted in the census was in 1870, and that actually is true, because African Americans, or those who would become African Americans later on, became counted into the 1870 census because at this point 14th Amendment had been passed. 14th Amendment got passed in this country in 1868. At least that's when it was ratified and approved by Congress. So at this point, they were citizens of the United States. And so they were recorded as in history as African Americans moving forward. So that's what I should have said. That's what I meant to say in that video when I said that the first time black people were counted in the census was in 1870. It was the first time African American, the status known as African Americans, were counted in 1870. What is equally true is that in 1830, black people were counted in the census. These were free black people because back then they didn't count slaves. Slaves were not counted in the census. However, they did count free black men and women. Yes, you heard me say women. Women also own slaves. So the 1830 census records, and the records show, and the recording of that shows that there were free black men and women, and it counted who these families were and how many slaves they owned. So back then they didn't count slaves. They just counted the number of slaves you had. So you went to your house, they got your first name and last name, and in a different document or in a different schedule, they counted how many slaves you owned. So if you own 7 slaves, they just put number 7. If you own 34 slaves, they put 37, 34. Or if you own 162, they put 162. But the names of these slaves were not entered into the U.S. Census record. So slaves were not being counted. But free black men and women were. So if we wanted to know who these people were in history, you can just subpoena the records. FOIA, Free Information Act. You can subpoena or you can ask for these records and you'll be given these records. Okay. In many instances, the husbands purchased the wives or vice versa. Slaves of Negroes were in some cases the children of a free father who had purchased his wife. If he did not thereafter emancipate the mother, as so as many such husbands failed to do, his own children were born into slave and were thus reported to be numerators. Moreover, Wilson explains, benevolent Negroes often purchased slaves to make their lots easier by granting them their freedom for a nominal sum, or by permitting them to work it out on liberal terms. In other words, these black slave owners, the clear majority, clearly used the system of slavery to protect their loved ones. That's the good news. But the not so good news, but not all of them did, and that's also the bad news. Halliburton concludes, after examining the evidence, that it will be a serious mistake to automatically assume that free black owned their spouse or children only for benevolence purposes. Woodson himself noted that a small number of slaves, however, does not always signify benevolence on the part of the owners. And John Hope Franklin notes that in North Carolina, without a doubt, there were those who possessed slaves for the purpose of advancing their own well-being. These Negro slaveholders were more interested in making their farm and carpentry shop pay than they were in treating their loved ones humanely. In other words, these people were brutal to the slaves. Okay, they were very brutal. Okay, they weren't interested in treating them as human beings, the same way and the same image that we all have of white people being very brutal against black slaves. Black slave owners equally practice these same practices against black slaves. Okay, so that's what that says. For these black slaveholders, he concludes, there was some effort to conform to the pattern established by the dominant slaveholding group within the states in the effort to elevate themselves to a position of respect and privilege. That is the part I want you to focus on. So basically what that says is that black slave owners wanted to match their white counterpart, and they wanted to conform to the dominant slaveholders, which are the white people. So in an effort to make sure that their slaves were producing equally the amount of products and producing out the same, working in the same efficiency capacity as their white slave counterparts were doing, they also practice the same measure of discipline. That's what that is saying. So basically, they whipped their slaves into submission. They whipped them into producing. They perhaps caused a lot of the marks and the image that we see in our minds. Those beatings, those marks, those branding were caused also by black slave masters against their own people. That is hard to imagine. So that's what it's saying. So let me read that again. Okay. Let me start from John Hope Franklin. Okay. And John Hope Franklin notes that in North Carolina, without a doubt, there were those who possessed slaves for the purpose of advancing their own well-being. These Negro slaveholders were more interested in making their farms or carpentry shop pay than they were in treating their slaves humanely. Okay, the operative word there is humanely. They didn't care about seeing them as humans. They cared about the work and the labor. Okay, for these black slaveholders, he concludes, there was some effort to conform to the pattern established by the dominant slaveholding group within the states in an effort to elevate themselves to a position of respect and privilege. In other words, most of the black slave owners probably owned family members to protect them, but far too many turned to slavery to exploit the labor of other black people for profit. Let's talk about who these black slave owners are, who they were. Okay, so I would imagine that the names of these people, wherever their descendants are today, have perhaps changed their names. Okay, because that is not a good look. That is not a good look to have a last name of a black slave owner who mutilated, dehumanized, tortured, okay, people that look like them for the purpose of profiting and advancing their economic status. Is that incomprehensible? It is. But is it far-fetched for us to think that black people back then were all about the money as equally as we know black people today are? Do we know black people today who are all about making money? Do we know them? Certainly you do. Black people use words like get rich or die trying. Okay? Black people use words like get rich or die trying. Black people historically, whether they're from Africa, whether in this country, we've seen behaviors where black people have sold their people down the river for money. Is it possible that the so-called ADOS and the founders of ADOS are doing this today? FBA, the Tariq Nasheeds, the Yvette Carnell, the Antonio Moore. Are you telling me that these people haven't heard of this story? Now, I can tell you that for Tariq Nasheed, I can guarantee you that I don't worry about his level of education. I think the highest level of education he's got is a high school diploma. I don't even know if he has that, but his highest level of education is high school. Okay, you can certainly see that by the way he talks and how he carries himself, that he has no intelligence. So I'm not really going to reference him. He's someone that I can't really talk about because when it comes to intellectual thinking, we don't talk about people like him. But Yvette Carnell and Antonio Moore, these two at least strike me as intelligent people. Most especially Antonio Moore, who is an attorney, who graduated from UCLA and is a practicing attorney. Are you telling me that he, throughout his whole education, never learned of black people that were slaves in this country? I have an MBA, and even within my MBA status, and during my MBA education, even while this was not taught in school, but because I went through the institution and advanced learning, I've learned to really study, do research. So even within my educational level, I'm able to at least find these facts. Are you telling me There's someone like Antonio Moore, who is an attorney. He's one of the co-founders of ADOS. Does he know this? Are you really telling me that he hasn't learned of this? Yvette Carnell. These two haven't learned of it. I find that really hard to believe. So the point I'm making is that there are black people amongst us who know the truth and shield the truth from their own people as a way to exploit their people, to exploit their people's emotion for gains. These are practices that were exhibited by black people back in the days. We're learning this. And these are practices that black people are doing today, unfortunately, against each other. How many times have we seen and heard of politicians that really galvanize black people only to sell them down the river? How many times have we seen black leaders, churches, that somehow galvanize black people only to sell them down the river? These behaviors are not new. These are things that black people, whether in this country or even Africa. So we're not going to exempt the African. There are leaders and black people in Africa that do exactly the same thing. These are practices that have been done by black people, but they're not only exclusively black. These are practices that are exhibited by every race. But we're not talking about every race today. We're talking about black people today. Okay, so to have black people back then exploit their own family members, there were black people, slave owners, that even threatened and in many cases sold their family members who they disagreed with and who they fell out of favor with, sold them to white slave owners that they knew had a reputation for torture and for evil practices. These slave owners sold their family members to these white planters that they knew had a reputation in town. That's what black people did back then. Is it far-fetched to say that black people today are doing the same thing? Okay, so this is not to demonize the black race, but this is to tell you that the black race is imperfect, just like the white race is imperfect, just like the African race. None of our races are perfect. So stop the finger pointing. Okay, so let's talk about, now who are these slave owners? Okay, so we're going to start with John Stanley. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce his middle name, but we're just going to go with John Stanley. So John Stanley was born a slave in Craven County, North Carolina, the son of an Igbo woman. Now, Igbo tribe is one of the tribes in Nigeria. So again, many of the slaves that came into the United States from Africa, many came from Nigeria, from the Igbo tribe. I, for one, come from the Igbo tribe. So his mother was a slave from the Igbo tribe. Okay. By the early 1920s, Stanley won 3 plantations and 163 slaves. And he even hired 3 white overseers to manage his property. He fathered 6 children with a slave woman named Kitty, and he eventually freed them. Now, Stanley lost his estates when a loan for over $14,000 he had co-signed with his white half-brother. Can you imagine this? John came due, and after his brother's stroke, the loan was Stanley's sole responsibility, and he was unable to pay it. So the net of it is that Stanley lost his fortune based on this. I'm not going to bore you with a lot of the story, but the key part that I wanted you to get from that was that he owned 163 slaves. Okay, let's talk about William Ellison. So William Ellison, fascinating story is told by Michael Johnson. Michael Johnson, you got to go read his book, Black Masters. Okay, so he talked about William Ellison. So basically, at William Ellison's death, on the eve of the Civil War, Ellison was wealthier than 9 out of 10 white people in South Carolina. Imagine that. In 1822, he opened his own cotton gin and soon became quite wealthy. Okay, he owned 63 slaves. Okay, that's William Ellison. All right, so we want to talk about Antoine Duplessis. Antoine Duplessis. Okay, Antoine Duplicat was born in 1810 in Louisiana to free black parents. His father was a planter who owned about 406 acres of land and 70 slaves. And after the death of his father at age 54 in 1828, Antoine inherited his father's estate and went to marry a wealthy black woman. Okay, the combined asset was estimated roughly at $95,000, making Duplicat one of the wealthiest planters of his time. Okay, let's talk about Anthony Johnson. Anthony Johnson was recorded in history the first black person to ever own a slave. Okay, so it says that Anthony Johnson was the first prominent black landlord in the English colonies. Johnson arrived in Virginia in 1621 aboard the James. It's uncertain if Johnson arrived as an indentured servant or as a slave, so most people don't know it, But the early records list him as Antonio, a Negro. So he worked on a tobacco farm until he gained his freedom. Then he purchased 250 acres of land and ran his own successful tobacco farm. Let's talk about somebody else. Marie Therese. So Marie Therese was born into slavery, but died a rich woman. Okay. At the turn of the 18th century, Marie Therese was one of the richest ladies in Louisiana. We're talking about black people here now. And as a free lady, she was an astute entrepreneur, as well as a social climber. Moreover, she was also Christian-minded and worked to improve the society she lived in. She was born into slavery. Okay, so while she was born into slavery, she did also have some education as a child. The records show that she had children, young children, 5 children to be precise. By 1830, it is estimated that she owned more than 1,000 acres of land, with an estimated 287 slaves working on the land. So who's next? Okay, so let's talk about Nathaniel Butler. Nathaniel Butler. Let's talk about Nathaniel Butler. Nathaniel Butler, not all slave owners of color purchased slaves in order to keep their family united. However, Nat Butler was far from sentimental. Now, once he gained his freedom, his sole concern was making as much money as he could, with trading slaves seen as the best way to earn some fast money. So cutthroat was Butler in his dealings that it wasn't just slaves who feared crossing his path. His ruthlessness was also noted by white plantation owners, ensuring that Butler wrote himself into the history book. So basically, Butler was so revered by even white slave owners that they, in their crazy, saw him to be even more crazy. They saw him to be a brutal person. So most slaves with Nat Butler, most slaves prayed they didn't cross paths with him. A lot of the slaves that escaped from their white plantations would pray and hope they didn't cross paths with Nat Butler, because many people knew of him and knew of his evil dealings. So what was so bad about Nat Butler? Nat Butler is a scum. This is why I call him a scum. Because of the slaves that didn't know who he was. When slaves ran, many times when they crossed paths and he saw them, he deceptively told them to hide in his cabin at his place. So many slaves will hide with they hid themselves from the white slave owners who were looking for them, and they hid themselves, at Nat Butler's home. And so when these white slave owners would come and they would approach Nat Butler's house, many times they were on carriages and horses, and they would ask, "Hey, did you see a couple of black Negroes running around and runaway slaves?" He would tell the white slave owners, "No, Didn't see nothing, Boris. Didn't see nothing. I didn't see nothing. Okay? And the reason why he did this was because he would later on try to find out how much bounty each one of these slaves had on. How much bounty was on each one of these slaves so he can claim it for himself. And so when the bounty was high and plenty and was a large sum of money, he will intend capture these slaves and return them back to the white slave owner and collect the money. And when he found out that the bounty wasn't that much, he would buy the slaves and resell them for a higher amount of money. So this is why I say he was a scum, because he lied to the black slaves who saw him as a refuge. Again, not all kinfolk. It's kinfolk, right? So these ones that didn't know who he was, when they ran into him, they thought he was a person that they can count on. Someone, one of those free abolitionists. And so he deceived them and they took his word for it. They thought they were safe, only to find out later on that they were not. That Nat Butler would in turn sell them or return them back for money. It was also known that even of the slaves that he purchased for himself, he was so brutal in his punishment and the way he dealt with them that these white planters, these white slave owners, were very, very surprised and shocked at the way he dealt with the slaves. So basically, the images that you know of how white people dealt with black slaves, Nat Butler tripled that whole punishment. He was so evil that all he cared about was money. Do we know anyone like that today? Do we know black people today, or a few black people, that will do anything for money? They will even sell their family members down the river for money. Do we know any today? Have you come across anyone like that? The ones that believe on get rich or die trying, by all means necessary. Okay? Lie, cheat, steal your way through riches. That's Nat Butler. That is the spirit of Nat Butler. People that do these things. Is it possible that a lot of the so-called ADOS who are misleading their people down the river, selling their people down the river for gains, is it possible that a lot of these people are descendants of Nat Butler? Because I find it incredibly disturbing and disgusting. I've always found anyone that intentionally deceives others for profit to be despicable people. Because I can't see and I can't come to grips with the idea that somebody would do that, would deceive others, intentionally omit or withhold information, to intentionally deceive others for gain. This was the practice of a lot of black people that owned slaves back in the days. It was for money. It was for the come up. It was for the status. They didn't care that they were once slaves themselves. But now that they were free, they in turn did harm to people that looked like them. They didn't care that these slaves were dehumanized, were mistreated. They didn't care. All they cared about was working the slaves to death, was making as much money as they wanted to make. All they cared about was competing with their white counterpart. Do we know people like that today? Do we see such behavior today? Do we deny, or can we deny, that a few of us in black communities exhibit these types of personality? These types of personalities that says, I will do whatever it takes. I will lie, cheat, steal to get whatever I want. I mean, we hear about the black on black crimes, how black people kill each other for profit, for money. Is this far-fetched for us to think? Is it incomprehensible for us to see or think that there were black people doing this back in the days? We're seeing this happen in our own timeline today. Black folks not caring for one another. Again, this was not all black people. Okay? This was not even the majority of black people that were in this country. Majority of black people that were in this country were slaves in this country. But of the ones that were slave owners, the type of behavior that we're now learning, and the type of ways and the practices that they exhibited is such that it's incomprehensible that black people did this to black people in this country. I, for one, I'm sick to my stomach to learn this part of history. While disturbing this is, and while disturbing this whole part of history has been, it's important for us to know this. Because if you're going to base reparation on a lie, on a one-sided truth, I think it's important for you to tell the entire truth. Okay? The black people have not been all entirely victims of this whole thing. They benefited. They fought against the abolishment of slavery. They participated in it. They dehumanized one another. The ancestors of a lot of our brothers and sisters in this country, the many so-called ADOS, many of whom could very well be descendants of these black slave owners. And many very well could be actually descendants of actual slaves. We would never know. Because I would imagine that whoever the descendants of these slave owners are today, I would imagine that they've changed their names to hide amongst us. I would imagine that they've changed their family names that we just read of a few of them. I would imagine they've done that. I would also imagine that when the war was won and the North conquered the South, I would imagine that these ones, right, sort of blended in with the slaves and perhaps attended those meetings with, Sherman. Meetings around the distribution of properties and all of that. Perhaps these ones denied that they were slave owners. I wasn't there. I can only imagine. And deceptively blended in with those who were slaves for fear that they will be routed out, for fear that they will be pointed out, for fear that others will look at them and say, hey, you were a slave owner. Why should we give you land? You own this land. Did they have their lands confiscated? I don't know. Did they lose their land also? Did they run away and left and abandoned their lands? I don't know. These are gaps in the history that I don't know. Okay? What I do know is that I'm sure that these people fled and perhaps cowardly denied that they were landowners or denied they were slave owners, or at least went to hide when the Northerners came in, marched in. Perhaps some of them died in battle. Perhaps some of them lost their lives in battle. Perhaps. I don't know. But I can almost guess that some of these people perhaps infiltrated the camp of the newly freed slaves and aligned themselves deceptively. And today we have descendants of these people amongst us today claiming reparations, wanting to be paid reparations for an evil act that they took part in. So how do we know who these people are? We don't. Okay? So the point I'm trying to make is that there have been a lot of years have gone by. Slavery happened in this country for almost 250 years. And we have been away from slavery for almost 150 something years now that we have since had a slavery occurred in this country. A lot has happened. People have traveled. People have intermingled. A lot has happened. And so when the California Task Force voted 5-4 to award compensation based on lineage to so-called descendants of slaves, I wonder if they also took into consideration that among those so-called descendants of slaves were also descendants of slave owners who were black in this country. Are we awarding compensation to them? Or did they just somehow gloss over that? Now, you wouldn't tell me that, the chairperson of the task force, who is an attorney, okay, you wouldn't tell me that she has never heard of this before. So the point I'm making is it possible that some of our people or some of these people championing reparation know the true answer to this, and they're somehow leading their people astray, selling them down the river for a profit? I don't know. But what I do know, and I'm going to conclude with this video here, is that black people, African Americans, their ancestors sold and bought slaves. That is a fact. The ones championing reparations, ADOS and FBA, their ancestors bought and sold slaves, profited from the institution of slavery. That I do know. What I also do know is that white folks, while we have somehow been taught to demonize white people, that they were only the orchestrators and the ones that pushed and bought and owned human beings in this country. That is not true. The majority of white people did not own or even condone slavery. There's only a few ones in the South that did. That is also equally true. It's also equally true that Africans, not the entire continent, participated in slavery. It was a few Arabs in Africa that did this. They sold all the Africans into this country. So, anyway, so that's my video. I hope this has enlightened a lot of you. I hope you've gotten some information out of this. If anything, this video was intended to show you the other part of our American history, to help you understand that perfection and imperfection doesn't lie with one race or one group of people. We all are complicit in all of this. And I hope that this will help you to channel your feeling and see each other different and see people differently and begin to partner and begin to embrace the best part of us. That's what I hope. I'm not a messiah, okay? I'm not a messiah. I'm just giving you from one citizen to another my own perspective. So anyway, thank you all for watching. Give this video a thumbs up, share the video, subscribe to the channel, as well as hit the notification bell, and I will see you all next time. Ser det som ett allt är det jag vill wifa. De här yardis, de vill ju bara dra ner oss. Men du är fett och vanlig. På det jag lägger all min tid. Jag vill ha det. Du får mig känna safety. Jag kan nog ner det baby. Och jag kommer aldrig ändra mig.